If you want to understand Aquinas' 5 ways to prove the existence of God, you have to understand Aristotle's Metaphysics. Now, if you don't know what metaphysics is, click the video in the top right corner to give you a bit of an introduction on metaphysics. Now, one of the things you do need to learn to understand Aquinas' 5 ways, especially the first way, is act and potency. Now, before we get into the video, I just want to let you know if you have any questions or even objections to the philosophical content in this video. I actually made a Q&A Google Sites where you can submit your questions and your objections for the material for this video specifically, and if I have an answer, I may display the question and my answer for the public to see. So act and potency is a concept that kind of explains the idea of motion. And when Aquinas says motion, he's not necessarily talking about displacement from this location to the other, but more in the general sense, and the word change is a better way to explain it. So essentially, act and potency is a way to explain change. Now, Aristotle in his book Physics actually talks about 4 different modes of change. It could be substantial, so think about ice melting. It could be qualitative, like a human being becoming healthy, or a piece of metal getting hot. It could also be quantitative, let's say like a child growing up to become an adult. And it can also be locomotive, where something moves from one location to the other. Now, what is potency? Well, potency is the tendency for something to undergo a certain change. Take a rubber ball, for example. It can potentially be red if we decide to paint it, and it could potentially be a glob of goo if we decide to melt it. And so those are 2 examples of an idea of potency. Now, potencies can come in 2 different kind of forms. They can be active or passive. An active potency would be something like me seeing. Like, let's say I close my eyes. Now I have the potency to be able to see. When I open my eyes, I'm actively engaging in the activity of seeing. I could also potentially be pushed by a certain external force. And so that would be an example of a passive force because I have the potential to be changed by something outside of myself. Now, one of the things that you should take in mind is that not everything has the potency to be anything. This rubber ball doesn't have the potency to become a tiger. It only has certain potencies in it, and those potencies are innate to the rubber ball. As Dr. Ed Fraser would say, it cannot bounce all the way up to the moon, or it cannot follow a human being wherever he or she goes. That's not possible. The potencies are things that are innate to the rubber ball, and it cannot just have any potency whatsoever. Now, what is act? Well, act is essentially the realization of that potency. Now, to make it even more simpler, potency is the tendency for a change, and actuality is the fulfillment of that change. This rubber ball has the potential to become red, and once we actually paint it red, it is actually red. Or if we melt it, it is now actually melted and gooey. Now, one thing that might sound pretty obvious, but actually might be pretty important, is that potencies cannot fulfill itself by its own. Aquinas says potency does not raise itself to act. It must be raised to act by something that is in act. A rubber ball cannot be melted by something that is potentially hot. It has to be melted by something actually hot. And the mere fact that this rubber ball can be potentially melted into goo cannot by itself fulfill that potency to actually become goo. Now, this stuff might sound pretty obvious, but once you take this into context of the first way, you might find that it's actually pretty interesting, but we won't get into that in this video. There's some other important points that might be worth noting. One is that Aristotle explains that in the natural world we live in, everything is a combination of act and potency. A pen, by the mere fact that it exists, means it is actual, but it also has the potential to be, let's say, broken in half. A human being can be breathing, walking, sitting, which are examples of act, but a human being could also have the potency to grow taller, or it may have the potency to digest food when you're not actively digesting food. We have the potential to get wet in the rain, and so many other potencies. And so everything in the natural world we live in is a composite of act and potency. Now, one exception that Aristotle has to this is the idea of the unmoved mover. Aristotle also has a special case for something called prime matter, and Aquinas also has a pretty special case for angels. These things we won't get into today. Also, another thing that Aristotle says is that nothing can be purely potential. It's always going to be a combination of act and potency. A ball cannot potentially be painted red if it wasn't even a ball in the first place. I cannot potentially grow taller if I didn't exist in the first place. And that's why potency cannot exist by itself, and it always has to exist in combination with something in actuality. The only exception that Aristotle brings is the idea of the unmoved mover, which is God, and the unmoved mover is pure act. And once you actually learn the idea of the first way, it will become more clear to you why the unmoved mover, or God, is an exception to the idea of act and potency. Now, another thing that might be worth noting is that Aristotle says that actuality, in every case in the context of change, has priority over potency. And so let me give you some examples. Aristotle says that actuality is prior to potency in terms of logic. He says that potential in a certain thing is potential because that thing can become actual, and that knowledge of the actual must be present before you have knowledge of the potential. In other words, knowing the actuality of water must be known in order to know that ice has the potential to melt into water. Aristotle also says that act is prior to potency temporally as well, in terms of time. Aristotle says the actually existent is always generated from the potentially existent by something which is actually existent. For example, the tree has to exist first in order for the seed to exist, for the seed comes from the tree. Finally, Aristotle also says that act is prior to potency in terms of substance. Because these potentialities are potentials for the sake of a certain end, that is why it's prior in substance. And Aristotle gives the example, for animals do not see in order that they may have sight, but have sight in order that they may see. And so those are three ways in which Aristotle explains that act is prior to potency. And so that is the concept of act and potency. Again, if you have any questions or objections to any of the philosophical content, feel free to use that Q&A Google Sites that I have set up in the description. And yeah, that's it for this lesson. So if you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing, and maybe I'll catch you in the next video.